All right, so we've already covered the general framework for how we think through investing from a generosity mindset. We have these two major categories: provision capital, which is meant to provide for our own needs and the needs of our family to some degree, and then released capital, which we have fully released for kingdom use. And we've talked about several subcategories within each of those two larger buckets. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the first two transitions, both within this realm of provision capital. The first of those is investigation, where we move from shadowed to illuminated capital. And the second transition is harmonization, where we move from illuminated to aligned capital. So let's start right from the beginning. Can you break down a little bit for us this process of investigation?
Yeah, for most of us who have investment accounts, chances are that capital is shadowed. The process of investigation is really about doing the research and trying to gain an understanding about the impact that our investments are having on others. And once we've done that research, the capital can move from shadowed to illuminated because we now have gained a better understanding about the impact of our investments. It doesn't necessarily indicate that we've made any changes. This is all about gaining awareness and understanding.
Now, I'm sure for somebody listening to this, especially somebody listening to some of these ideas for the first time, there are immediately some walls that might come up in terms of actually moving towards taking this step. Can you break down some of the most common barriers that might hold somebody back from taking this step of investigation for any of their investment accounts?
Yeah, we tend to see 5 barriers that prevent people from navigating this investigation process, moving capital from shadowed to illuminated. The first barrier is ignorance. I just never thought about it. It never occurred to me that the things I invest in are impacting other humans. I thought of this as a financial transaction.
And honestly, I think that has been one of the biggest barriers for me in the past. It wasn't really until the last few years where I had any idea that any of this space even existed, that there was research to be done, understanding to be had about what is happening with my investments. And I've learned a lot from you in the advising world and from many others who have gone through this process themselves and really come to some amazing conclusions about what was actually happening because of their investments, and then setting the stage for some of the steps that they would go on to take later.
The second barrier is apathy. The idea that it's really not my problem. Those are companies run by other people. I'm just an investor. I'm just trying to make some money here. So if they are helping or hurting people, it's really not my responsibility.
And as an advisor, what would you say to somebody who's coming from that background?
Well, the very nature of investing in a company, when you purchase stock, you become an owner in that company. And as an owner, you do carry the weight of responsibility, even if it's a fractional, tiny little piece of ownership. The things that you profit from, you essentially are voting for. You are making a statement by taking ownership that you are in favor of, or at least tolerant of, the activities that are going on to generate the profit that you are benefiting from.
Yeah, I guess if you zoom out a little bit, we have so many layers of removal from the actual practices and work that is being done at the companies we invest in that it's easy to feel like it's something totally foreign from any of our own decisions. But if you were to zoom in, say, a company that you owned completely, that you founded and built from scratch, the way that you would treat your employees, your clients and customers matters significantly because of your relationship with Christ, because of the way that he has redeemed every part of us and how we act. And it also has significant implications for what your company actually does. If you, as a Christian, were to create a company that produces and distributes pornography, for example, that would cause you to significantly wrestle with that decision. Can I really go on profiting from this as a Christian, as somebody who has been renewed in Christ? If you take that one layer back, what if you had several partners, maybe 10 other partners, and you just owned a piece of the company? How would that change your convictions? I think most would argue that you still have a significant responsibility for what is being done by and through this company that you own. If you zoom out even further, what if there were 1,000 other investors? I don't think that removes any responsibility from us as believers just because others are involved in the decision making process.
There are actually many scriptures that talk about this concept of how you make money does really make a difference. One example is from Proverbs chapter 10, verse 2, that says, "Ill-gotten treasures have no lasting value, but righteousness delivers from death." What does it mean to have ill-gotten treasures? I think we tend to think of stealing from people, but also profiting from activities that are harming people in the process of making money, I think would go in that same category. Now, a third barrier to investigation is what we call deflection, where we accept that there is responsibility for how money is made, but it's not our responsibility as investors. It's for the people running the company, it's for the people who are directly engaging with clients and managing employees. But as an investor, I'm removed from that.
So, what would you say to somebody dealing with this kind of a barrier in investigation?
I think the structure of mutual funds and ETFs creates some of this mentality because we do feel very removed from the actual activities. And in many cases, we're completely unaware of what companies we actually own in the first place, much less how they're earning money and what kinds of activities they're conducting. And I found that throughout the investigation process, as we discover what we are actually taking ownership in, it becomes much deeper than a financial transaction. Even if a company only represents less than 1% of your overall holdings, you still may be profiting from ill-gotten gains.
Yeah, I think this concept actually goes much further than investing. I think of numerous cases in just recent history where companies have made decisions that many people knew to be wrong, to be harming other people. And it's not uncommon for people to feel a conviction to not engage with the company at all, to not be purchasing their products or their services in order to not align themselves with something that might be harming others. That's even more so true if we are actually funding the activities of the company through our investments, no matter how far removed they are.
Right, because when we invest in a company, we provide them capital to help them grow and do more of whatever activities they're doing. So we tend to have a cleaner conscience when we invest in companies that we think are helping people and doing good things in the world, providing goods and services that we think are helpful.
Now, as we're thinking through this level of responsibility we have and whose responsibility it actually is, whether the company's or ours as investors, or whether there's a shared responsibility, I can imagine there are many people who would say, I would rather just not know at all. It's better not to even know what's going on because then I can have a clean conscience.
And that's our fourth barrier, which is apprehension. Because I think we recognize that if we uncover something that we don't like, then we will feel that responsibility to do something about it.
This actually reminds me of Romans, where Paul is talking about the law and being condemned under the law. And he says, if the law is what produces sin because we are now aware of the standard that God has, would it be better to not have the law at all so there can be no sin? And then he says, by no means. The law is still perfect and given by God, and we shouldn't hide from it to remove our responsibility. There is something deeper, and that is the blood of Christ, which came to destroy the power of sin. And while Jesus has done the work, we are being constantly reshaped to be more like him, to be more perfectly aligned with his standard. And I think that is just as true in how we invest. In the same way God might convict us of some personal sin in our lives, he will start to show us how our investing is hurting and harming other people in the world, and through that begin to gradually reshape how we act as investors. So we've covered quite a few barriers, from ignorance, having no idea what's going on, to apathy, not really caring enough to investigate in the first place, to deflection, saying there is a responsibility, this is important, but it's not my responsibility. it belongs to the company and those who run the company. And then two, apprehension, saying, I recognize that there is probably some responsibility for me. It's better not to know at all what's going under the hood so that I don't have to come face to face with that responsibility. Now, for somebody that's worked through each of these barriers, I think the final question and barrier that comes to mind is, so what do I do about this? How do I actually go about this process?
Yeah, and this is a common place where people do recognize that as an investor, they hold responsibility and they want to investigate, but they're not sure how. That's what we call paralysis. And that is our fifth barrier to investigation, where we say, I don't even know where to start.
So, as an advisor, when you see somebody walking through this process of, okay, I want to actually understand what my investments are doing in the world, where do you tell people to start?
The simplest way to begin our investigation process would be to look for a biblically responsible investment screening tool. There are at least a handful out there. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. But the way that they work is you enter in the investments that you already have, and it delivers a report to you screened for biblical values. Different screening tools have different criteria, but they are designed to give you the information that you need to actually make an investigation and move capital from shadowed to illuminated.
So, you mentioned these different criteria. What would be maybe some of the differences from one screening tool to the next in terms of how they approach what would be an investment that is causing harm in the world? What's an investment that's causing good in the world? What's that look like?
The various screening tools that I'm familiar with might come from a denomination. They might come from a fund company that has managers that have spent time and developed their own convictions. And it's important to recognize that there's no such thing as a perfect, holy company. If you look hard enough, you're going to find something objectionable in everything that you invest in. So there is an element of best efforts and personal conviction. But the good news is there's a growing number of products on the shelf where you can seek to find alternatives to what you already have in your shadowed portfolio. So it's not so much about finding the perfect investment. It's more about recognizing that there are alternatives. There are companies and funds being managed that pay particular attention to the impact that their operations have on people and places.
So there's some helpful tools for individuals, but advisors themselves have access to a next tier of resources. Is that right?
There's a growing number of advisors who have made biblically responsible investing a high priority within the way that they manage portfolios. So, for investors who have done some investigation and are looking to take that next step of harmonization, there are actually quite a few advisors who are equipped to do that well.
Well, it's exciting to see a growing ecosystem of tools, resources, advisors, and investors who are taking their investments seriously, really seeking to align them fully with God's kingdom and trying to shed light on how our resources affect others. After somebody's gone through this investigation stage, bringing their capital from shadowed to illuminated, then comes the process of harmonization, actually taking action. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, harmonization is where we actually respond to what we find during the investigation process. And there are three main approaches to this process. We call them avoid, embrace, and engage. And as investors, as owners of the companies that we invest in, we can choose to screen for things that we find morally objectionable, that do not align with biblical values. And we can try to eliminate companies engaging in those activities from our portfolio. That would be an avoidance of things that are harmful. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22 says, abstain from every form of evil. And without going into all the examples, there are certainly companies engaging in evil activities and making a lot of money doing so. And so avoid is about moving away from those companies as investors.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. That's in line a lot with what we were talking about earlier. So, what do you mean when you say embrace?
While there are a lot of companies that are harming people in places as they make a profit, there are quite a few companies that are doing good works and providing good services that help people that solve problems in the world. And as investors, when we choose to invest in those companies, it provides fuel to promote activities that contribute to human flourishing. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7 says, "Seek the peace and prosperity of the city." Obviously, we can give money to nonprofits that are doing good work, but there are also companies who share that same heart and operate in the marketplace. And when we try to harmonize our investments with those companies, it's an extension of our expression of generosity.
Okay, that makes sense. Avoid and embrace, kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. So what's engage then?
As shareholders or owners, we actually get a seat at the table. Companies have shareholder meetings where anyone who is an owner of the company actually gets a voice and a vote. Now, often we don't act upon that influence because we might own hundreds or thousands of companies in our portfolio and we just don't have the time or interest in attending shareholder meetings. But that influence still remains. And there are mechanisms through which we can allow fund managers to promote our values at shareholder meetings. And there's a growing number of managers and companies who step into this space and leverage their influence to promote biblical values across the companies owned within their portfolios.
So you're saying if I own a couple of shares out of millions of shares a company might have available, my one voice might be pretty small and it might not be realistic for me to actually show up at a shareholder meeting. But if I'm investing in a mutual fund oriented around some of these biblical principles, along with thousands or hundreds of thousands of other biblically responsible investors, then the fund manager of that fund may actually hold hundreds of thousands or millions of shares of a company that may be navigating some of these complex social and cultural issues. And their voice may actually be much more significant at the table in trying to shape how that company actually approaches the work they do, how they treat their employees, how they treat their customers, etc. Is that right?
Yeah, there are examples of groups of people who collectively invest in companies that they actually object to in order to have a voice and move the needle, leveraging their influence to represent biblical values. So avoid moving away, embrace moving toward, engage is having a dialogue.
Well, that's helpful. And I think that gives some context to how we actually go about this process of harmonization with our investments. What are some of the common barriers in going from illuminated where people know some of the effect that their investments are having and maybe even feel some discontent with that to actually going through this process of taking some action?
The most common and most powerful barrier to harmonization is what we call maximization. And this comes from a worldly concept that when we invest, the only thing that matters is the return.
Yeah, this reminds me of the power of mammon. In Matthew 6:24, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money."
Yeah, and that enters us into a really interesting and complex conversation where, as individuals, as investors, we have to decide what's most important to us when we choose how to invest. Now, you might assume that if we choose companies that are doing good in the world that adhere to biblical values, that we either have to take a lot more risk or give up a lot of return. That's certainly not always the case, but there are some cases where companies will prioritize having a positive impact over making as much money as possible. And you may find that they grow more slowly or kick off less profit. And there are lots of investors who feel really good about supporting those companies. I think having an overall philosophy around your investing and really understanding what's important to you as we seek to honor God with everything that He's entrusted us will allow us to actually engage in this process of harmonization, not just thinking about it, but doing something about it. Now, the second barrier to harmonization is complexity. This concept that this all sounds like a lot of work. I'm going to have to think pretty hard about it. I really just want to keep my financial picture as simple as possible so I don't have as much maintenance. And this is where it's extremely helpful to engage with an advisor who is pursuing these same values themselves and in the way that they work with investors, because they can take that complexity and navigate it well in a way that's suitable for you as an individual, which takes a lot of the work off of your plate.
And it sounds like there's a growing ecosystem of investing tools that individuals can use on their own that try to figure out some of this legwork for you ahead of time.
And we don't necessarily have to know every company under the sun and handpick the right ones. There are mutual funds run by managers who have done this work for you, and those are easy to access and in many cases run excellently. Now, the third barrier is complacency. If you've been investing for a long time and you like your style and you've been getting results that you're happy with, it can be difficult to introduce new concepts that might require you to make some changes.
Yeah, I think this is true well beyond investing too. Any area that God might convict us in our hearts about some action or pattern in our lives, especially if it's one that has been deep rooted for a long time, is going to come up against this wall of complacency. How important really is this to God? Is this something that I really need to change and put in a lot of effort on? Or can I just keep on going like I always have been? And it's the same in this case. It involves allowing the Spirit to mold and shape our hearts in terms of how we see the world to align better with how He sees the world, and then repenting and allowing ourselves to be renewed.
The fourth barrier to harmonization is futility. The idea that even if I do make some changes in my portfolio, it won't really make a difference in the world.
Yeah, this reminds me of another season of life back in high school and college. All the peer to peer downloading engines were becoming really popular. Lots of people were downloading free music all the time and videos and TV shows. And having very little money as a high school and college student, it felt easy to justify that I'm just one little person amongst millions of downloads of this song or this movie. Does it really even matter in the long run if I really pay for this or not? And God went through a process of slowly convicting me that even if the individual impact that I was having was small, it was much more important for my heart than it was for whatever my dollars were actually doing, that I continue to be aligned with Him and in avoiding what was essentially stealing. And I remember wrestling with that because it seemed like my actions had so little impact on everything externally. But I'm so glad for that struggle because I think it did much more for my heart. And that has been true of this entire investing framework that we've been talking about. It has so much to do with our heart and how God aligns us with Him in that.
There's certainly a formational aspect to the decisions that we make, and we are accountable for our decisions alone. So even if we don't save the world by rebalancing our portfolio, there's an opportunity for sanctification to happen as we lean in. Our fifth and final barrier to harmonization is compartmentalization. This idea that my investing is for making money and my giving is for doing good.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really interesting one for givers, especially people who are already very generous. Generosity can almost allow us to use our giving as a justification for the means of our investing to say, I give so much already. I don't need to worry about what's going on through my investments because I've already done what I need to do. And I think that God calls us to something deeper than that, that it's easy to, in this whole generosity journey, to feel like we have finished the race, but there's always a deeper level to go to. And I think this was actually an area for me. It was easy to say, I'm very focused on giving, on generosity. I just don't need to worry about or figure out this investing stuff on the side because it's really a minor thing compared to whether I give or not. But I think God calls us to something deeper and something greater.
I think what's been most helpful for me in moving past compartmentalization is restoring this idea of relationship in investing. Like I mentioned before, we are so removed from the actual work that's being done that we can oftentimes be completely unaware of what we own in our own portfolios and what that means for others. But if we zoom in once again and take it to an example of, I want to invest in this relationship with you I want to see a certain impact on the world, and we're going to do that together as partners. That's really what investing is at its core. And so when we treat people like things for the sake of making money, the relational aspect of investing gets suppressed. So to acknowledge that and to call that forth, recognizing that the way we use money can be an expression of love, then it actually opens up more opportunities to express generosity through giving and investing together.
Now, one question that may be coming to mind for some people is, yeah, this might make sense for my brokerage account where I have a little bit more control and individualization in what I can choose and the decisions I can make. But what about my 401k at my company or my HSA or my 529 plan, which might have a pretty limited set of funds? How do you approach those kind of investments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reality is, we don't always have control. And once again, there is an element of best efforts, but I have seen helpful dialogue multiple times where an employee at a company has an honest conversation with the owners or the team that selects the investments that go into a 401k and actually have been successful in having new options added to the menus so that they can more closely align even their 401k with their values. So it may require some creativity, some relational equity, some thinking outside of the box, but I believe that there is a right step for each of us to take in this process.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we've covered a lot here, all about investigation, trying to understand what's really going on under the hood with our investments, with the capital that we steward, and also with harmonization, taking meaningful steps to bring those investments into better alignment with the kingdom. In our next episode, we are going to be talking about the final two transitions of release and activation. So stay tuned.